Maybe it's better if you stay in the lounge tonight, my husband said quietly, adjusting his tie without even looking at me. The words were soft, almost polite, but they landed with the weight of a closed door. The ballroom outside was glowing with warm light, crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors, and the low hum of conversation drifted through the hallway like distant music. It was Daniel's company celebration, a formal event held in one of the most expensive hotels in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where a single glass of champagne probably cost more than the groceries I used to buy for our family dinners. I had spent an hour getting ready that evening, carefully brushing my silver-streaked hair, choosing a navy dress that I thought looked elegant without trying too hard. Daniel had barely noticed. When we arrived, he greeted his colleagues with easy confidence, shaking hands and laughing in a voice I hadn't heard at home in years. But when I stepped beside him, he leaned slightly closer and whispered those words, suggesting that maybe I should wait in the smaller lounge down the hall until the important introductions were finished. I didn't argue. After 27 years of marriage, you learn to recognize when your presence has become inconvenient. So I walked quietly down the corridor, the soft carpet muting my steps, until I reached a quiet lounge with leather chairs and a tall window overlooking Lake Michigan. The city lights flickered across the dark water like scattered coins. I sat down with my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to the distant music from the ballroom. It wasn't the first time Daniel had made me feel like an afterthought. When we were younger, he used to introduce me proudly as the woman who helped him through law school, the woman who believed in him when his career was only a fragile idea. Back then, we shared everything: late nights planning our future at the kitchen table, small apartments with thin walls, the excitement of building something together. But success changes people in quiet ways. As Daniel climbed higher in his company, his world began to fill with polished executives, private golf outings, and conversations that sounded like a language I was no longer meant to speak. Somewhere along the way, the woman who once stood beside him became someone easier to keep just out of sight. I told myself it didn't matter. The lounge was peaceful, and from where I sat, I could see the edge of the ballroom through a wide doorway. Men in tailored suits moved through the crowd while servers carried trays of sparkling drinks. Laughter rose and faded like waves. Every now and then I wondered if Daniel might come back to get me once the introductions were finished. He never did. Nearly 30 minutes passed before the quiet was broken by the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. I assumed it was another guest looking for a moment of quiet away from the party, but when the man stepped into the lounge, he stopped the moment he saw me. He was tall, maybe in his early 60s, with calm gray eyes and the kind of presence that makes a room feel smaller without him saying a word. He studied my face for a moment, as if confirming something in his memory, then walked closer with a faint smile that carried both surprise and recognition. "Eleanor Brooks?" he asked gently. I blinked in confusion. I had never met him before in my life, yet the way he said my name made it sound as if he had been expecting me. When I nodded slowly, still unsure why a stranger would recognize me at a party where even my own husband preferred I stay hidden, the man's smile widened just slightly, and he said the words that would change everything about that night. "I've been searching for you for a very long time." I looked at him carefully, trying to understand why a stranger at a crowded corporate celebration would know my name. The music from the ballroom drifted faintly through the hallway, a slow jazz melody mixed with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. But inside the lounge, everything felt strangely still. The man stood there with quiet patience, as if he had just confirmed something important. I cleared my throat and said politely that he must have mistaken me for someone else. He shook his head immediately, the small smile never leaving his face. He said my name again, slowly and clearly, Eleanor Brooks, and there was something almost relieved in his voice. For a moment I felt self-conscious, wondering if perhaps I had met him years ago and simply forgotten. Life has a way of collecting faces that blur together over time, yet his expression suggested something different, something deliberate. He pulled out one of the leather chairs across from me and sat down with the calm confidence of someone who was used to being listened to. Up close, I noticed the details that hinted at a lifetime of experience, the subtle lines around his eyes, the quiet steadiness in the way he carried himself. He asked if I remembered a small consulting workshop in Boston almost 15 years earlier, a seminar organized for young managers trying to build new departments inside growing companies. The question surprised me because I had nearly forgotten that part of my life. Long before Daniel became successful, long before our children finished college and moved away, I used to volunteer at community business programs. I had always enjoyed helping people organize ideas and solve problems. I told him that I remembered speaking at a few small events back then. Nothing important, just practical advice about managing teams and communicating clearly with employees. He nodded slowly as if every word confirmed a memory he had carried for years. He explained that he had attended that workshop quietly, sitting near the back of the room while several consultants presented their polished theories about leadership. According to him, most of those speakers had impressive resumes, but little understanding of how real people actually work together. Then I had stepped forward with a simple presentation about listening to employees, treating them with dignity, and building trust inside a company instead of fear. I laughed softly when he said this, because I had always believed those ideas were common sense. He did not laugh. Instead, he told me that the strategies I described that day later helped him reshape the culture of a struggling division in his company. He said the changes saved millions of dollars and eventually influenced the management structure of the entire corporation. Hearing this left me speechless. I had never imagined that a small volunteer seminar could travel so far beyond that modest conference room. For years, I assumed those ideas simply disappeared into the air, like most conversations do. I told him that I was glad the advice had helped someone, but surely there were many other experts who contributed to his success. The man shook his head again, this time with a quiet certainty that made my chest tighten slightly. He said he had spent years trying to locate the woman who gave that talk, because he believed she deserved recognition. When he asked for my contact information back then, the event organizer told him I was only volunteering and did not maintain a professional office. After that, he searched through old conference records, trying to track down where Eleanor Brooks had gone. He paused for a moment before adding that he never expected to find me sitting alone in a lounge during one of his own corporate events. The words did not fully sink in until he casually mentioned the name of the company hosting the celebration that evening, Carter Global, the same name printed in gold letters on the banners hanging throughout the ballroom. A small chill ran through me as I realized that the calm, thoughtful man sitting across from me was not simply another guest escaping the noise of the party. He was the man who owned the entire company. William Carter leaned back slightly in his chair, studying me with a thoughtful expression, and asked a question that made the situation feel even more surreal. He asked why someone whose ideas had shaped so many of his company policies was sitting quietly alone while the rest of the executives celebrated in the ballroom just down the hall. I did not answer his question immediately. Instead, I looked down at my hands resting in my lap, noticing how tightly my fingers were folded together. For a long moment, the quiet of the lounge felt heavier than before. The distant music from the ballroom continued, cheerful and bright, as if nothing unusual was happening just a few steps away. I finally smiled politely and told him that the explanation was much simpler than he probably imagined. I said that I was only waiting there for a little while because my husband was busy greeting important guests. William Carter did not interrupt me, but I noticed the subtle change in his expression, the careful way he watched my face while I spoke. Some people have a way of listening that makes it clear they hear more than just the words. I added that corporate events can be overwhelming, and that sometimes it is easier to step aside and give executives the space they need to conduct business conversations. Even as I spoke the explanation out loud, I realized how practiced it sounded. It was the same type of sentence I had used many times over the past decade, a gentle way of smoothing over moments when Daniel preferred that I stay slightly out of view. The truth was less comfortable to say directly. Success had gradually changed the way my husband saw the world and the people inside it. Early in our marriage, we used to attend small gatherings together where nobody cared what someone wore or how polished their resume sounded. Daniel would proudly introduce me to everyone in the room, telling stories about how I encouraged him to pursue his ambitions when he was still unsure of himself. Back then, we felt like partners, walking the same road. But as the years passed and Daniel moved higher inside the company, the rooms we entered became larger, brighter, and more exclusive. Conversation shifted from dreams and ideas to titles, investments, and influence. Somewhere along the way, Daniel began to act as if my quiet, practical background no longer fit comfortably beside his growing reputation. William Carter listened without interrupting while I spoke slowly about those changes. I did not complain about my husband, and I did not accuse him of anything unkind. I simply described how the distance between us had grown in small ways that were easy to ignore at first. There were dinners where Daniel asked me not to bring up certain topics because they sounded too modest for the company he was keeping. There were charity events where he introduced me only briefly before drifting toward groups of executives who spoke a different professional language. Tonight had followed the same familiar pattern. When we arrived at the hotel lobby, Daniel seemed tense in a way I had not seen before. He explained that the chief executive officer himself would be attending the celebration, and that the evening might influence several promotions within the company. His words carried the careful excitement of someone standing close to a long-awaited opportunity. I remembered placing a reassuring hand on his arm and telling him that everything would go well. He smiled quickly, but his eyes kept scanning the crowd. A few minutes later, he gently suggested that I wait in the lounge while he greeted the senior leadership team. I had nodded without hesitation because I understood how important the night was to him. I told William Carter that marriage often requires small acts of patience, and that sometimes stepping aside for a moment can make life easier for everyone involved. When I finished speaking, the lounge became quiet again. The chief executive officer leaned back slightly in his chair and studied me with a thoughtful expression that made me feel as if he was measuring something far beyond the simple story I had just shared. Finally, he spoke, in a calm voice that carried both curiosity and disbelief. He said that it was strange to hear such a careful explanation from the very woman whose ideas had helped reshape the culture of his company years ago. Then he asked a question that made my heart pause for a brief moment. He asked if my husband, Daniel Brooks, knew that the strategies he proudly discussed inside Carter Global boardrooms had originally come from the quiet woman sitting alone in the lounge just outside the celebration. I felt a quiet heat rise to my face when he asked that question. For a moment, I did not know how to respond, because the truth was both simple and complicated at the same time. I shook my head slowly and told him that Daniel did not know anything about the workshop in Boston or the small presentations I used to give back then. In fact, I said that my husband probably did not remember that period of my life very clearly at all. William Carter watched me carefully, the way someone studies a puzzle that is slowly beginning to make sense. I explained that when Daniel and I first married, our lives were very modest. We lived in a small apartment outside Columbus, Ohio, where the kitchen window looked out over a parking lot and the heating system rattled every winter. Daniel was still finishing graduate school, and I worked several part-time jobs to keep things stable. During those years, I spent evenings volunteering at community development programs because I believed that helping young managers learn practical leadership skills could strengthen local businesses. Those seminars were never meant to be a career. They were simply something I enjoyed doing while Daniel worked toward his future. When he finally received his first corporate position, everything began to move quickly. New cities, new offices, new responsibilities. I stepped away from the volunteer programs because our children were young and Daniel traveled frequently. Someone needed to keep our home steady while his career accelerated. William Carter listened quietly while I spoke, occasionally nodding as if he understood each chapter before I even finished describing it. I told him that over time the seminars faded into the background of my life. They became little more than a memory from an earlier season, when Daniel and I were building our dreams side by side. Meanwhile, my husband continued rising through the corporate world. Each promotion brought more expectations, more formal gatherings, more evenings where conversation revolved around mergers, quarterly reports, and strategic planning. I never complained about those changes because success was something we had both worked toward for many years. Still, I noticed that Daniel rarely mentioned the ideas we used to discuss together at our kitchen table. Back then, we would spend hours talking about leadership, about how employees respond to trust and respect rather than pressure. Many of those conversations shaped the advice I shared at the Boston workshop long ago. Hearing William Carter describe how those same principles later influenced Carter Global felt both surprising and strangely distant. Like discovering that an old letter you once wrote had traveled across the country without your knowledge. The chief executive officer leaned forward slightly and asked whether Daniel ever talked about leadership strategies at home. I smiled gently and admitted that he often did. In fact, many evenings over the past few years, he described new management approaches his company was adopting, approaches that sounded very familiar to me. I never interrupted him when he spoke about them. I simply listened and felt quietly glad that the ideas seemed to be helping people somewhere in the world. William Carter was silent for several seconds after I finished speaking. The distant music from the ballroom shifted to a slower song, and the faint sound of applause echoed down the hallway. Finally, he asked another question in a calm voice that carried a hint of disbelief. He asked if Daniel Brooks realized that the management philosophy he admired so much inside Carter Global had originally come from the woman he had asked to wait alone in the lounge tonight. I looked toward the ballroom entrance for a moment before answering, because I could see Daniel standing near the center of the room, surrounded by several executives. He looked confident, animated, exactly the way he always did at corporate events. I turned back to William Carter and quietly told him the truth. My husband believed those strategies were created somewhere inside the company leadership team. He had no idea they were once spoken by the woman who had been sitting beside him at the kitchen table many years ago. I did not feel embarrassed when I said those words. If anything, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you finally see the full shape of something you have lived with for years. William Carter remained silent for a moment, his eyes thoughtful as he looked past me toward the open doorway of the ballroom where the celebration continued. The sound of conversation and music drifted into the lounge again, bright and lively, as if the world on the other side of that doorway had no idea how unusual this quiet conversation had become. Finally, he stood slowly and walked toward the entrance of the lounge, pausing just long enough to glance back at me. His expression had changed slightly, not with anger, but with a quiet decision that seemed already made. He asked me one simple question. He asked if I would mind joining him in the ballroom for a moment. I hesitated because that was the very place my husband had suggested I avoid earlier that evening. For years, I had learned to recognize the invisible boundaries Daniel preferred in public settings. Crossing those lines usually meant uncomfortable looks or short conversations afterward on the drive home. Yet something in William Carter's voice made the request feel different. It was not a command, and it was not an invitation meant to impress anyone. It sounded more like a correction to something that should never have happened in the first place. I stood slowly from the leather chair, smoothing the front of my navy dress out of habit. As we walked toward the ballroom together, the music grew louder, and the warm light from the chandelier spilled across the polished floor of the hallway. The moment we stepped inside, several people near the entrance straightened immediately when they recognized the chief executive officer. Conversation softened and heads turned in subtle waves across the room. I noticed how quickly attention followed him, the quiet gravity that comes with leadership. Daniel stood about 30 feet away, near a group of managers and senior directors, holding a glass of sparkling water while speaking confidently about something that made the others nod in agreement. He looked exactly the way he always did at these events, composed, focused, certain of his place in the room. When he finally noticed William Carter approaching, his posture shifted instantly with a mixture of excitement and surprise. The group around him stepped slightly aside as the chief executive officer walked closer. I remained a step behind, uncertain whether Daniel would even acknowledge my presence once he realized I had entered the ballroom. My husband greeted the executive with a firm handshake and a respectful smile, clearly aware of how important this moment might be for his career. Before Daniel could begin speaking, William Carter placed a calm hand lightly on my shoulder and guided me forward until I stood beside him in full view of the group. The gesture was simple but unmistakable. Daniel's expression changed the moment he recognized me standing there. For a brief second, he looked confused, as if he could not understand how I had appeared in the middle of the gathering he had been carefully navigating all evening. The chief executive officer spoke before my husband could say anything. His voice was steady and warm, carrying easily across the small circle of executives surrounding us. He introduced me by name, Eleanor Brooks, and said that he had just spent the last half hour speaking with someone whose ideas had influenced many of the leadership strategies Carter Global now used throughout the company. Several people in the group exchanged curious glances. Daniel frowned slightly, clearly trying to follow where the conversation was going. Then William Carter said something that caused the entire group to fall silent. He explained that many years ago he attended a leadership workshop where a volunteer speaker described a management philosophy built on trust, communication, and respect for employees. He said that philosophy later helped reshape the culture of one of his most important divisions. Then he gestured gently toward me and told the group that the woman who gave that presentation was standing in front of them now. For a moment, nobody said anything at all. The music continued to play in the background, and glasses clinked somewhere across the room. But inside our small circle, the silence felt almost electric. Daniel looked from William Carter to me and back again, as if trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. I met his eyes calmly, not with accusation, but with the quiet certainty that sometimes truth simply arrives in a room, whether anyone planned for it or not. I watched the silence spread across the small circle of executives, like a ripple moving across still water. Daniel's face shifted through several expressions in the space of a few seconds. Confusion first, then disbelief, and finally the careful composure he always used when he felt the ground moving under his feet. He forced a polite smile and gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they think a misunderstanding is about to be corrected. He said that there must be some mistake, because his wife had never worked in corporate consulting or executive leadership programs. His voice remained calm, but I could hear the tension beneath it, the same tightness that appeared whenever something unexpected threatened his carefully organized image. William Carter did not argue with him, and he did not raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with the same steady tone he had used in the lounge, the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that shaped entire companies. He explained that the presentation he attended in Boston had not been a formal consulting engagement. It had been a volunteer leadership workshop organized for young managers trying to understand how to build strong teams. He described the room in surprising detail, the rows of folding chairs, the whiteboard at the front of the conference hall, and the moment a woman stood up to speak about leadership not as a system of pressure, but as a practice of listening. Several people in the group leaned in slightly as he spoke, clearly curious about the story unfolding in front of them. Daniel remained still beside me, holding his glass a little too tightly as he listened. William Carter continued by describing the ideas that had stayed with him for years after that seminar ended. He spoke about the importance of communication between leadership and employees, about the power of treating people with dignity instead of fear, about creating workplaces where trust replaced constant pressure. As he listed those principles, I felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and disbelief because I recognized every one of them. They were the same conversations Daniel and I used to have late at night when we were young and trying to imagine what a better workplace might look like. At the time, those thoughts had seemed simple, almost obvious, the kind of ideas anyone might share around a kitchen table. Yet hearing them repeated now inside a ballroom filled with executives made them sound almost unfamiliar. William Carter finally turned toward Daniel and asked a question in a calm, curious voice. He asked whether Daniel had ever wondered where some of the company's most widely used leadership strategies originally came from. Daniel hesitated before answering. He said that as far as he knew, those strategies had been developed by senior leadership teams over many years of corporate research and management experience. Several executives around us nodded in agreement because that explanation was the one most people inside the company believed. William Carter smiled slightly when he heard that response. He then explained that the foundation for many of those ideas came from a single presentation given by a volunteer speaker who never asked for recognition or compensation. He gestured toward me again with quiet certainty and said that the woman who gave that presentation was standing only a few feet away. The group grew even quieter as those words settled into the room. I could see the shift happening around us even before anyone spoke. Executives who had been relaxed only minutes earlier now stood straighter, their attention focused completely on the quiet exchange unfolding in the center of the ballroom. Daniel remained very still beside me. The confident rhythm he usually carried at company events seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a careful silence that felt almost unfamiliar. For the first time in many years, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment, something deeper, the kind of realization that arrives slowly when pieces of the past begin to rearrange themselves into a new shape. William Carter did not rush the moment. He allowed the silence to breathe for several seconds, as if giving the room time to absorb what had just been said. Then he spoke again in the same calm voice that had guided our conversation from the beginning. He explained that leadership ideas rarely appear out of thin air inside boardrooms. They grow from conversations, from observations, from the quiet insights of people who understand how human beings actually work together. Many of the most important strategies inside Carter Global, he said, came from principles that valued listening over control and respect over pressure. When he first heard those ideas at that small workshop in Boston, they felt different from the complicated theories presented by other consultants. They felt practical and human. That was why he remembered them so clearly. Several executives nodded slowly as he spoke, recognizing the philosophy he was describing because it had shaped many of the company training programs they themselves had studied. William Carter then turned his attention gently toward Daniel again. He asked whether Daniel remembered the early years of his career when he used to speak passionately about treating employees as partners rather than subordinates. My husband blinked slightly, clearly caught between surprise and reflection. I knew exactly what memory the chief executive officer was referring to because I had lived inside those conversations. There had been countless evenings when Daniel and I sat at our small kitchen table discussing how companies could build loyalty by valuing people instead of intimidating them. At the time, those conversations felt like dreams shared between two young adults who believed the future could be shaped with patience and integrity. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. He said that he did remember those ideas. He explained that early in his career, he had searched for management philosophies that felt genuine rather than mechanical. Many of those beliefs later appeared in the leadership programs Carter Global promoted internally. William Carter listened with a faint smile before asking one final question that carried a gentle weight across the room. He asked Daniel if he remembered where those ideas originally came from. My husband did not answer immediately. His eyes moved from the chief executive officer to me, and then back again, as if he was trying to reach into a part of his memory that had not been opened in years. I watched the recognition arrive slowly across his face. It was not dramatic. It was quiet and almost fragile, the same way old photographs sometimes reveal details you never noticed before. Daniel looked at me again, this time with a different expression than the one he carried earlier in the evening. The tension in his posture softened slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like disbelief. I realized in that moment that he was remembering the same nights I had just been thinking about, the late conversations in a small apartment, the shared hopes about building workplaces where people felt respected. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The room remained attentive, the music drifting softly in the background, while the story William Carter had uncovered continued to unfold without anyone raising their voice. Finally, Daniel exhaled slowly and nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth that had been quietly waiting for him to notice it again. When he spoke, his voice carried a sincerity that surprised even me. He admitted that many of the ideas he built his career around were first discussed with me, long before his company adopted them as official strategy. The words hung in the air between us, simple and honest, yet powerful enough to change the way the room now looked at the quiet woman who had been sitting alone in the lounge only an hour earlier. I noticed the room breathed again after Daniel spoke those words. It was subtle, almost invisible, but the tension that had filled the air a moment earlier shifted into something else entirely. People were no longer watching out of curiosity. They were listening with real attention now. William Carter gave a slow nod, not as a gesture of surprise, but as confirmation of something he had suspected from the beginning. His eyes moved briefly across the circle of executives surrounding us before returning to me. There was a quiet warmth in his expression that had not been there when we first met in the lounge. He said that leadership often remembers the voices that speak with clarity, even when those voices disappear from the room afterward. He explained that the presentation he attended years ago had stayed with him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was practical and honest. He had built entire training programs around those principles without ever knowing where the woman who first described them had gone. The executives standing nearby exchanged thoughtful looks with one another. Some of them seemed to be mentally tracing the history of their own management training, realizing how many of the ideas they now use every day were connected to the quiet story unfolding in front of them. Daniel remained beside me, still processing everything that had just been revealed. I could see that he was not embarrassed in the way people sometimes become when their reputation is challenged. Instead, he looked reflective, as if he had suddenly rediscovered a chapter of his own life that he had forgotten to acknowledge. William Carter spoke again after a moment, addressing both of us now rather than only Daniel. He said that companies often search endlessly for innovative leadership strategies, when sometimes the most valuable insights come from ordinary conversations between people who genuinely care about others. He gestured gently toward me as he said that many of the policies Carter Global now used to guide its management teams were shaped by the philosophy I had once described in that small workshop room in Boston. The idea that something so simple could travel so far seemed to fascinate the people around us. A few of them even asked quiet questions about the workshop itself, curious about how such practical ideas had been developed long before they appeared inside corporate manuals. I answered calmly, explaining that those thoughts were never meant to become a formal system. They were simply observations about how people behave when they feel respected rather than pressured. I described how Daniel and I used to talk about those things when we were young, long before either of us imagined standing in a ballroom filled with executives. As I spoke, I noticed that several listeners began nodding in agreement, recognizing the same principles they had tried to apply within their own teams. William Carter listened carefully to every word. When I finished speaking, he folded his hands together thoughtfully for a moment before making a statement that changed the direction of the entire evening once again. He said that ideas like those deserved more than quiet appreciation. They deserved to be heard again in a world where leadership often becomes too complicated to remain human. Then he looked directly at me and asked whether I had ever considered returning to the work I once enjoyed so much. The question caught me off guard because I had not thought about those workshops in years. Life had moved forward with children, relocations, and the steady rhythm of supporting Daniel's career. I told him honestly that I had not planned to revisit that part of my life. William Carter smiled gently when he heard my answer. He said that sometimes the most meaningful opportunities appear when a person least expects them. Then he said something that caused another quiet wave of surprise to move through the circle around us. He explained that Carter Global was preparing to expand its leadership development programs across several new divisions, and that the company would benefit from guidance rooted in the philosophy I had described. His voice remained calm and thoughtful as he asked if I would be willing to help shape that initiative. For a brief moment, the entire ballroom seemed to fade into the background. The music continued to play, and conversations continued across the room. But inside our small circle, everything felt still again. Daniel turned toward me slowly, his expression no longer uncertain, but quietly respectful. It was the same look he used to give me years ago when we talked about ideas that might change the future. I realized then that the night had become something none of us could have predicted when we first walked into the hotel earlier that evening. I stood quietly for several seconds after William Carter finished speaking. The soft music in the ballroom continued, the warm lights from the chandeliers reflecting off the marble floor, and yet everything inside that small circle felt suspended in time. I had spent so many years believing that part of my life was over that hearing someone ask me to return to it felt almost unreal. My mind drifted briefly to the small conference room in Boston, where I had once stood in front of a whiteboard explaining simple ideas about trust and leadership to a group of young managers who were just beginning their careers. Back then, I never imagined that those conversations would travel beyond that modest room. I certainly never imagined they would one day lead to a moment like this. I looked at William Carter and told him honestly that I had never considered turning those ideas into something larger. Life had moved in a different direction. My children grew up, Daniel's career expanded, and my role gradually became one of support rather than public contribution. I said that I was not sure whether I still belonged in rooms where executives discussed corporate strategy. William Carter listened carefully and then smiled in a calm, reassuring way that reminded me of the confidence he carried from the moment he walked into the lounge earlier that evening. He said that leadership was not measured by titles or by how often someone appeared in corporate meetings. Leadership was measured by whether a person understood how to bring out the best in others. According to him, the ideas I described years ago were not outdated at all. In fact, they were exactly what many organizations were trying to rediscover in a time when workplaces often felt too mechanical and impersonal. The executives standing around us seemed to agree. Several of them nodded thoughtfully, and one of them even mentioned that the company's most successful teams were often the ones that practiced the very principles I had described earlier. Hearing that made the entire situation feel less like an unexpected spotlight and more like a quiet recognition of something that had simply been waiting to be noticed. I took a slow breath and said that if Carter Global truly believed those ideas could help people, then I would be willing to share them again. I explained that I was not interested in recognition or corporate status. What mattered to me was whether the conversation about leadership could remain grounded in respect and understanding rather than competition. William Carter extended his hand with a warm expression and said that was exactly the perspective the company needed. Around us, the atmosphere of the ballroom gradually returned to its earlier rhythm. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked softly, and the band continued playing near the far end of the room. Yet I could still feel the quiet shift that had taken place. Daniel stood beside me during all of this, listening carefully. When the small group around us finally began to disperse, he turned toward me with a thoughtful expression that I had not seen in many years. It was not the polished confidence he used during presentations. It was something much more familiar. He told me quietly that he had forgotten how many of the ideas that shaped his career began during the years when we were building our lives together. There was no dramatic apology in his voice. Only an honest recognition that somewhere along the path of success, he had allowed those early conversations to fade into the background. I smiled gently because I understood how easily that could happen. Life moves forward quickly, and sometimes the most important influences become invisible simply because they were always there from the beginning. As the evening continued and people returned to their conversations, I realized that the moment when I sat alone in the lounge earlier felt very far away now. The same ballroom that once seemed like a place where I did not belong had quietly become a room where my voice mattered again. And for the first time in many years, I felt the same quiet excitement I had felt long ago in that small workshop room, when sharing an idea with sincerity felt more valuable than any title someone could place beside your name.